Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. We're here with Mark Mcgrath, who's a movement expert in Australia. And Mark, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself so we can get a full spectrum picture. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Mark Mcgrath. I work as a movement coach, rehabilitation specialist, body worker, and I consult to athletes and I work with the general public. Most people tend to come in with either some sort of a problem, usually rather than a objective, but then, through an assessment and discussion, being able to put them on a course of action which, leads them towards optimal posture, function and movement.
So let's start with a model for movement. And you were telling me a little bit earlier offline that there's a vocabulary that's happening that precedes really what everyone's seeing on Instagram or these really high level performance or movement videos from someone like Ido Portal or his lineage of followers. So if you can create that model for us.
Yeah. So if we think of all of nature as the canvas, and then when we think of ourselves as humans, we almost separate ourselves from the rest of that. So let's put ourselves back in and say we're an upright mammal. So that uprightness is part of this miracle of upright posture, and the upright mammal predominant movement is its gait mechanism, which is out of phase rotation. So there's a support function through one diagonal of the body and a stepping function on the other diagonal of the body. So when we mature from a baby to upright, that's the pattern that we all express, the gait mechanism. So gait is actually really a fundamental movement assessment if you know what you're looking for. When we're born tonic, meaning that the body is flexed, internally rotated, and adducted. Adducted meaning that the limbs are towards midline. And then our phasic system, which is the opposite of those three, so external rotation, abduction, and extension, is part of this maturation process which creates muscle balance and coactivation. And so posture going forward is a coactivation. Now, so that's the tonic and phasic system need to balance each other out, right throughout our lifespans. Now, within that, there is a deep stabilizing system of which the diaphragm, the thoracic diaphragm, is the hierarchical king. At 6 weeks, diaphragm comes online in maturation, and TL junction, thoracolumbar junction, is stabilized and the baby can begin to lift its legs. So in other words, we can't lift our legs until the spine is stabilized. So to lift the legs, we need a fixed point for the legs to be able to lift from, which is thoracolumbar junction. And then that's mature by 4.5 months. And not long after that, we can cross midline with our hand, which begins rolling or turning, which is the beginning of ipsilateral stability, which is left-right body, right-left body. So in other words, from the brain's point of view, the left and right get differentiated. And then around 6 months when the beginning of crawling happens, that's the beginning of contralateral stability, or the ability to move through the diagonals. And no one taught any of us to do this. In other words, it shows that it's a program. So we've got that whole process sort of matures round about the age of 4, and then the foot fully matures about the age of 6, and we've got adult level motor control at 7. So if you say to me, where are we going wrong? I think all of that gets assumed that we can just do it, and we can't. we go to school, we start to learn formalized and specialized activities. It's never revisited as important. So posture, stability, the breath, just feeling the body, because, schools are so interested in, the conceptual development. And then we start having problems, at some stage, and that's when we might begin to address it. But most of our exercise is around loading the system with all of this living as an assumption.
Yeah. Well, this point that you're making is it's a really interesting one whereby movement is a neurological system. It's the brain in action, right? It's the interface between the fascia, the muscles, and what one intends to do. Consciousness, for lack of a better word. And I think most people just see exercise as a metabolic process, right? It's just kind of do more repetitions and faster movements, but there's not really much sophistication behind it. Where's the learning process?
Yeah, well, the feedback basis that comes when you're working on the stabilizing function, because ideally what happens, when we breathe in, it's just, the lungs and the atmosphere in relationship. So in other words, when we breathe out, our next inhalation is just coming from a change in the pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. Now, when most people think of a deep breath, they're actually, like sucking that in far too hard rather than just allowing the inhalation to be. Now, at this point, as we go to exhale, which, for most people who have done any work through this, it's where all the action and the attention should be. In the DNS practice, we keep the abdominal wall gently expanded during the exhalation, meaning the diaphragm continues to produce a stabilizing function through the exhalation, and that's how the segments of the spine are stabilized from inside. And so that listening that develops, so that listening is like a global attention and awareness, can be done really simply on the floor, or is included as the difficulty of the exercises goes more towards uprighting. But maybe for the first time in your life, you've actually learned how to pay attention, because the demands of the task are 100%. What is this organism doing at its deepest level right now? And when you see, even advanced practitioners moving, often it's the TL junction which is not stabilized, because it's the point in the body where we have a lot of leverage to create, particularly extension. So all your yoga back bends and so forth are heavily leveraging off the TL junction. So we're doing all of these moves, which are nice to do, but they're still not really how this organism wants to move. Because at the pinnacle of our movement, we're a turning body. And that turn is occurring between the pelvic girdle and the shoulder girdle in counter rotation. So that miracle of movement is, at the very least, underappreciated.
Rotating, twisting.
Yeah, well, if you look
lateral
at
movements.
a boxer throwing a right cross, Federer hitting a forehand, all throwing motions are also using this mechanism. So once again, people are doing it, but it's not really being looked into in terms of uprighting of the spine, position of the diaphragm over the pelvic floor and hips, how the support function is creating the turn, and then the arm that's being, say, in the example of a throw, being stepped through, that's a stepping function. So it's actually only as good as your ability to wind to create the support for the throw. And then you've got your weight shift. So the weight shift is important, so you're not over efforting, like the idea of it's smooth and you're using a transfer of weight, and then your ability to catch yourself and balance, So then, like you can work on that all of your life and never get bored because you're tuning to those aspects of the task. In other words, it's mindfulness in action.
So let's unpack this term DNS for people, because I'm assuming you're speaking from this philosophy, correct? This.
Yeah, the support stepping is definitely their language. Yep.
So what is DNS?
Well, the Prague School of Rehabilitation it's about 100-year-old, but it's arose particularly out of Prague in the Czech Republic, and it's built on the work of a number of pioneers over about 100 years, and they've looked, as you were saying earlier, at they've observed movement, they've looked at the sophistication and neurological aspects, and particularly in the early days of pathology. So Professor Janda, who's widely regarded as the father of rehabilitation, he himself had polio and was a quadriplegic, and he used himself as an intense self-study to improve his function dramatically. And his ideas went against the mainstream views of activation, where he was saying that the main problem we have is inhibition. For example, in his lower cross syndrome, where the cross runs across the pelvis diagonally, if the hip flexors and the low back are tight on that cross, then and on the other cross of the lower abdominals on the glutes can't fire because the hip flexors are tight. And if you try to fire the glutes, then you'll just further work the low back. So he said you don't activate the glutes, you lengthen the hip flexors, which unloads the low back. And so that's where PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, and contract relax and all of those methods arose. So he was a great thinker and a pioneer on the neurology. And then Professor Voiter was in a German orphanage of cerebral palsy infants, and he was looking at them and saying, how can I just get them to get their heels on the ground? And so he came up with a whole sophisticated body of work called reflex stimulation, where you would facilitate support zones of the body that talk directly to the brain with the plasticity and get a result under the level of conscious thinking, particularly with the cerebral palsy babies. And then Professor Collage, who's still with us today, and he's really formalising, documenting and sharing the DNS work. He's added to it. When the Queensland Physio Group discovered the transversus abdominis in the early 90s, the diaphragm still wasn't seen as really like an essential part of the core. And it's really Professor Collage, with his observation of healthy development in babies, that came up with this missing piece, and that was sort of early 2000s. So historically, this information is young, and that I think that's a lot of why there's so much confusion around what this core is. But DNS is starting to get a lot of momentum, particularly among therapists. And it's really a way for society to have a basis of posture stability and then locomotion to whatever level you want to play with it, prior to going into what we might think of then, sports, competition and other things. If you do a search on Prague School DNS, there's Janda, spelt with a J. Janda. There's a lot of very good background reading people can do to at least begin to shift their perspective a little bit.
And it seems I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so DNS stands for Dynamic Neuromuscular Stability, and it's according to Professor Collage. The exercise side of it is evolving a lot even now, where we're seeing the applications of what the baby can teach us in its beginning movements and how we can really enhance athletic performance through a better understanding, particularly of how rotation occurs.
Well, I'm on your website, by the way. I'm going to throw that out now, markmcgrath.com.au, for folks who want to load that up while we're talking. I see you bring this movement approach into yoga.
Yep.
Tell us about this.
Well, the yoga postures initially really came from observation of nature. So once again, we're seeing long-term, very careful and precise observation, like yielding its intelligence. So if we look at, for example, triangle pose, Trikonasana, side warrior pose, they're in this ipsilateral stabilizing function category because they're training left-right body. And so when we move in that frontal plane, we're getting lengthening through structures that are like a brake, a handbrake to that movement. So quadratus lumborum, through the lateral hip, IT band, lat dorsi, but in that frontal plane. And then when we come to something like rotator triangle, where we're now forward but we're turning, that's like a contralateral, that we're in the contralateral stabilizing function. So we can use particularly the standing postures therapeutically very effectively to get length tension as it would ideally happen. So bringing the DNS principles of posture stability into the yoga postures and expressing them that way. So foot position, orientation of the femur, trunk on pelvis, and then instead of like moving into the position to get maximum range of motion, you're moving through the position with maximum stability.
Got it. And so in the case of stability, that's engagement in some form, in some...
Well, diaphragm horizontal to pelvic floor and hips, intra-abdominal pressure being maintained throughout. See, for example, if I'm in the posture and I've got TL junction extension, then I'm not really stable through the trunk pelvis. You know, the outer muscles are winning the arm wrestle. So this deep stabilizing system, and then particularly the early work with the baby on its back and on its front prior to lifting itself into the field of gravity, that's the feedback basis to be able to feel that, so you understand what it is to have good trunk-pelvis connection. And it also creates the space between the two girdles, the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle. It's a spacer as well as a connector. So you don't want to disrupt that in your movements because all of a sudden you haven't got core control. You know, you're side shifting or you're flexing, or because again, it's setting up the basis for that locomotion. How we keep coming back to it. But efficient walking uses no, I heard you speaking to Josh about containment of energy in the second law of thermodynamics. So we've got to put that into movement and see that people are moving with a great cost metabolically because they're inefficient.
Well, that's an interesting thread.
Yeah.
So let's actually go down that rabbit hole. Some people might make the case that that's the whole purpose for moving, in an exercise for health, sort of metabolic workout kind of a way. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, but see, then you would have to also include the Bohr effect with the breathing. So the initial, if I'm working hard and breathing and over-breathing, it's the same problem as overeating. So Buteyko breathing showed that if you can't hold your breath so you breathe in, you breathe out, halfway out, so you're on a neutral lung, and you can't hold your breath for greater than 15 seconds, it's the equivalent to breathing for 6 people. So we don't realise that over-breathing is a syndrome. And then if you're breathing up in your chest, then you are overusing the accessory muscles of breathing and you are living in sympathetic dominance. So you are not even doing a thing and you are overworking, both in each and every breath you're taking. So when we smooth the breath out because we've got the stabilizing function sitting under it, so in other words, it's integrated with respiration and we're nose breathing, then we have the appropriate blood pH because CO2 is the determinant of whether oxygen goes from the hemoglobin into the cell. So reduced breathing, bringing in the stabilizing function, and I'm talking about this because it's a necessary precursor to containment of energy. So I'm understanding that, and then I'm moving, and then I'm also noticing how I'm leaking in my movement with non-preferred strategies. So side shifting, with technology and young people nowadays, the change in the shape of the spine from ideal to non-preferred is happening much, much younger. We have got a tsunami of trouble coming, just in terms of low-level ailments, musculoskeletal dysfunction, because this stuff is even being understood less because there's many, many more ways I can just occupy myself that are sort of disembodied, to use a term. I'm not coming from a felt sense of myself, in my interactions, in the basic ways I'm using myself. I mean, another pioneer, Alexander, said this as well. He said it's, when he found out how we have problems with the whole head-neck structure through the posture, and he's written a whole series of books on what he calls use of the self. How is one getting in and out of a chair? How is one aware of your basic orientation? And it's something you do have to spend time attending to, but then having a practice that allows you to change the habits that are tending to run the way you do everything.
So there may be some folks that are hearing all this going, man, that just sounds really complicated, Mark. Like, can't I just go out and, do my workout? Why do I even need to think about all because don't get me wrong. I love, I'm an alignment guy when it comes to yoga asana, and there's a lot of people that do not want to go to a class where they have to think. Right, they go because they don't want to think. Right, it's sort of an escapism strategy, for lack of a better word. But why is this even important? What are some problems that can occur? Why do people need to approach movement differently?
Well, I'm having to explain this to you using words, so that's why it sounds complicated. There is actually no thinking in it, but there is attention. So if you say to me, what is thinking? It is conceptual. There's no concepts when we do this. It's the pure experience of the organism. So when you actually get up from a good practice, you are cleansed in the best way that I've experienced. So the attention is directed to the deepest aspects of the functioning, which doesn't involve concepts, although you may have a framework of what you're doing, in which you would bring in, how is this in relation to this? So that would be like a thinking element. But the pure experience is just breathing and feeling and, like posture. Every single animal in nature, if you look at a bird taking off, the very moment before it takes off, it uprights. You look at a cheetah running, you look at the big cats, the herbivores. This uprighting is like both a precursor but also necessary throughout all movement. And it's what we humans are losing, is just this basic sense of uprighting. So in other words, it's an energy and it's an intelligence. So when you say to me, is it an option? It's not an option. You either understand it or you suffer, because you're going to have some sort of pain syndromes.
And
you just got to, it's about taking some time to understand the means and then embodying those means. I mean, if we look at all the spiritual literature around embodiment, like a lot of society sort of shifting towards and interested in ourselves as a living system and the planet as a living system. So that, that livingness can't be broken down into something less than that. In other words, you can't reduce it. So we're actually realizing we have to shift our understanding to when we're having questions around being a living system and being part of a bigger living system, then that's what this shift in orientation is. It's like a better understanding of the embodiment of it, which does involve some sort of a means. So the formalizing of that, the understanding of that, is how we would think of any learning. But then it just becomes something that's quite seamless, sort of going forward, and we can play with it, have little experiments, and that's much more how I'd encourage the listeners to think about it. You are playing with your sophistication, your intelligence, as a living system, as an upright organism.
Let's return to the breath. You mentioned that that CO2 levels are integral into how oxygen is released from hemoglobin, as well as pH. And it's so interesting that in the biohacking world, there's a ton of emphasis being put on oxygen and getting enough, and Wim Hof breathing and all kinds of stuff, and mitochondrial upregulation and et cetera, but no one seems to be talking about the role of CO2. It's only when you get into breathing physiology and capnography that people start to pay attention to that. Can you go into this in more depth?
Yeah, well, it's the most fundamental aspect of your health, because it's something you can influence. It is habitual. So in other words, you either have an optimal breathing habit or you are somewhere between, suboptimal to pathological. It is actually, you could say it's our entire anatomy, because when you look at anatomy from a breathing perspective, we have layers, and the layers are definitely in relation to respiration and stability rather than, including locomotion, yes, but for example, let's just look at the abdominal wall. So the deepest layer of the abdominal wall is the transversus abdominis, and it's integral with the diaphragm. They're one functional unit. Then we have the internal oblique, and then we have the external oblique and rectus abdominis. Now they are layered in that way from that breathing perspective of the expansion of the abdominal wall eccentrically with the concentric activation of the diaphragm. So the whole thing is working from a breathing perspective. And then up in the thorax we have innermost transversus thoracus, and then we have internal and external intercostals. So in other words, the thorax and the abdominal wall from a breathing anatomy perspective are a mirror to each other. Now, underneath the diaphragm are all the organs. Your entire organ system is underneath this structure. When it changes its shape and pushes down, it's pushing down on the organ system all the way to the pelvic floor and hips. So for men, it's the prostate, right down just around the pubic symphysis, and for the women, it's the ovaries. But also all the major organs are getting this compression release, so it's like a tidal effect in terms of their health. So they need that. The organs need that shape change, that tidal shape change, in order for their function as well. And it's all sitting in a fascial net that's working with the breath stability. And when we're uprighted and we have a horizontal diaphragm, then the diaphragm is biomechanically in an ideal position to produce that downward force. So it works like an invisible piston. Above the diaphragm is the deep neck flexors, because again, above T4 we don't have anything that could create the stability. So we push the crown, that lengthening the crown without lifting the chest. And then that puts the deep neck flexors in a strong position. And that's because they're also part of this deep stabilizing system. So that's the entire structure from hips up to the crown, and then from below the hips is the feet, and they're incredibly important. But they also get neglected in terms of their role in, because they're an arch as well. They're a dome-shaped arch like the diaphragm is. And so it's telling us that they have that stabilizing input, And good use of the feet is, again, that back to that containment of energy principle and efficient movement. So it's just really seeing the body, differently, if you like. Like I've explained it from a few different perspectives, and they all interrelate.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about efficiency, and this kind of makes me also think of HRV and balancing ANS with breath, with movement. Yeah. And what's your? Do you get into this at all with your clients when you're in your coaching?
Yeah. Well, they get established in parasympathetic just via the means, because they're not overusing the accessory muscles of breathing, so they're not in a low level emergency with their posture and their breath. Because again, most people are living in a low level sympathetic dominance, which means fight flight. And it's even the pace of society. So again, if we're looking at aging function, we're accelerating the aging process via the stresses where society and our situations are placing on ourselves, and this means can be a counter or a balance to that dominating our existence. So we stop, we go to the floor, we set up like the baby would on its back, slow the breathing, begin to increase intra-abdominal pressure, lift the legs, take the femurs past 90 degrees to 100, 110 degrees. That's lengthened my spine. My paraspinals are on length, TL junction stabilized. But that very process is already having its effect. The fact that I've stopped and I've slowed down and I've begun to train in this way is, if I'm doing it consistently, it's very, very powerful way of looking after oneself as one travels, through a lifespan. Because it's not something that shifts next month, next year, 10 years' time. It's the same practice, although you have a refined understanding of it. But that's the good news, is you've got it for life, because it's part of how this nervous system matured. It's not meant to change. I mean, what's meant to change is how we spend ourselves competitively, performance-wise. But this has still got to sit underneath and throughout that too, because it's how this brain and nervous system wants to organize itself to move.
Define for us intra-abdominal pressure and how one creates that.
The diaphragm has a dual role, or it actually has three roles, so everyone's aware of respiration. It has a capacity to change its shape in the absence of respiration. Professor Collage did fMRI studies where he looked at the position of the diaphragm in respiration and then the position of the diaphragm where it changes its shape to produce intra-abdominal pressure, and it was lower. So if people talk about a deep breath, they're usually talking about over-breathing, but a deep breath must mean how low the diaphragm is relative to the lungs, and then its downward excursion to towards the organ system and the pelvic floor and hips. So when that shape change happens in the absence of respiration, that's what's producing intra-abdominal pressure. So it's the abdominal cavity gets pressurized via this shape change. Now, neurologically, we have this capability. If you think about you were going to lift a fridge, something really heavy, you would probably brace a little bit, and then you would like, and you've created an isometric shape change of the diaphragm, and you've increased intra-abdominal pressure to lift the fridge. But you can only do it for a few seconds. The thing is to train yourself to do it at a low level gently throughout. And that's when I said earlier that we get a gentle expansion of the abdominal wall and keep it through an exhalation, that's the training. That's the way it's achieved. So, Josh is aware, and another colleague, Tim Altman, I did some work with him where we were using capno trainers that they use in hospitals. They pick up CO2, exhaled CO2 molecules, and it gives you a reading of millimeters of CO2 in arterial blood. So to just be basically efficient, you need a score above 25 millimeters. Using this methodology, we were able to get scores above 40 millimeters of CO2 in arterial blood. So it shows you the link between respiration, the stabilizing function, being able to produce intra-abdominal pressure, and efficiency. In other words, it's the only way that we know to achieve it, because otherwise you're struggling to slow the exhalation enough to up the CO2.
You mentioned a few terms earlier that may need defining for some of the listeners: concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Can you clarify those?
Yeah, well, concentric is when a muscle is shortening to produce tension. So like think of a bicep curl, the dumbbell's coming towards the shoulder, the bicep muscle is shortening to bring the dumbbell up. Eccentric would be the controlled lowering of that dumbbell, so the muscle is lengthening under tension. Most people are not even aware of eccentric contractions, but they're the gold. Eccentric control is the gold of coordinated movement, and isometric is a muscle developing tension without changing its shape.
Let's go into this eccentric contraction, because Josh was, so for listeners who didn't hear the interview, this is with Dr. Josh Lamaru that you work with, and you guys work together. So he was talking a lot about this. Give us some examples.
Yeah, well, when say you walk uphill, you're breathing harder, you're working more metabolically. Walking downhill, you're like, oh, this is pretty easy, but the next day you're super sore. So it was the muscles working eccentrically to decelerate your body position relative to the slope as you walk downhill. So the actual, you were getting a free ride via these eccentric contractions, which were both slowing your motion down relative to the slope and helping you control your movement. Now, about a month ago, I Googled co-activation, so muscles co-activate. So, for example, we're never using just one side of a muscle. It's always in agonist-antagonist relationship. Now, when you consider that this is a global event in the body, I mean, you've got an area that's working, but you've got all these other areas playing their role, either isometrically, eccentrically, synergistically. When we do really well, we improve, a sport or a movement, it's because the braking forces helping the agonist, which is producing the force, helping that occur smoothly, is really the essence of eccentric control. So the muscle working eccentrically is acting as a brake skillfully so that the agonist is able to, produce its forces optimally. A good example from yoga would be like a skillful forward fold. So your feet are bilateral. They're just, your feet are symmetrical. You're just standing upwards, and you're starting to go forward from the hips to lower the trunk. The hamstrings are lowering the trunk eccentrically, and you're controlling the motion of the trunk forward in a forward fold. and it's the skillfulness with which you can lower the trunk while maintaining symmetry. And that's some of the other postural and stabilizing aspects that are necessary. Like, for example, you should be maintaining intra-abdominal pressure throughout that movement. Yeah.
And why do you think this is so important? So the gold that you called it.
Well, it's where the sophistication lies. You know, if you play piano, you want to get better at it. You know, you want to play different music, more complex music. You want to test your skill. It's just what's happening as movers, but we're not maybe acknowledging it or understanding how we got good. You know, so it just means you can address it and start to train it. You know, and regardless, if you have an injury, the way the therapist will rehab you is to work on the injury like body work, but then you'll be doing eccentric contractions. You know, contract relax is when we say, for example, I've got a tight quad and I'm stretching it, and the therapist says kick into me in order to contract the quadricep. And then they say, now relax, and then they put it on length. That's where the good stuff happens. It's when the quadricep is lengthening under tension that we improve, because that's how the tightness dissipates, and the brain says, I don't have to protect that muscle as much as I thought because it's lengthening. You know, once again, I think I describe it as the obvious and the invisible. We only start to see the invisible with good observation, and that's what a lot of these great pioneers have given us, is this is how it's actually working, but it's not obvious. You know, it's years of good observation to, that's what's happening, you know, and playing, experimenting. And that's what our movement practice should be too, you know.
Well, it reminds me when I teach group yoga classes, for example, and I observe, would just take the example of like a handstand press. It's a movement that many people sort of aspire to achieve in the yoga world, right? And what I see a lot is it's easy. It's so much easier for people to lift up than it is to lower down.
Yeah. It's the act. That's the active expression, and then the lowering down is the control expression. Yeah, and it's a different attention too. There's a more refined attention to the control aspect.
This is sort of this is coming out of the blue here, but are you familiar with brain gym and cross lateral movements as they affect the left and the right hemispheres?
Yeah.
Is this something that you find effective in terms of learning and getting into a whole brain state with athletes?
Look, I think it's more about the principle. So if we look at our hemispheres of the cortex, and then the highway that runs between them is called the corpus callosum. So what happens when we do movements that actually ask for more left-right integration, then we get more connections across that highway. But, you know, every time we cross midline, you know, that's happening. So it's happening a lot. I think these people have got, like good ways to approach that they've unpacked the neurophysiology a little bit. But it's in all good movement systems. I think it's more like how we're able to do it throughout. So often we'll cherry pick like different activities and say like this is doing this, and it's true, it is. But what was your control prior to that? And were you able to control it throughout? Martial arts have certainly worked on this. If you look at, I don't know if you've ever seen anything on the Shaolin monks, but their their global coordination, their use of weapons, their acrobatics, it's a profound multi-dimensional expression of every possible way of, getting this body to do something, But notice that they go into a monastery to do it because it requires such discipline and, long-term application. I think the simple message is just start to notice more how you're doing what you're doing. How are you getting a bowl out of the cupboard? What's your lowering mechanism? It's just the beginning of this self-observation that allows you, and then you might be able to give someone better if you want an improvement in some area, you can at least give better information. I know with Josh and I, when we're often working with our clients, it's like, the better the information they give you, the more you can work with that, and the more enthusiastic and excited you get to work with the material because you see that they're on board, This idea of I come here and someone fixes me, it needs to go. It's always happening in relationship. Or its long-term effectiveness is via relationship. It's like, if you're teaching your class and the class is giving you something back and there's a good energy, then you love what you're doing. It's that intersubjective mutual understanding. We're understanding each other. Not only are we understanding each other, we're excelling in the understanding. This is the pinnacle of, when we do really well as a collective. It's a key thing to highlight because we can all do it, but we've got to acknowledge we've got to do it. We've got to give feedback, I'm noticing this. And then the instructor says, oh, great, now I know where you're coming from. I can give you some great information back,
There is a concept I recently read about in osteopathy around the term I believe is the bowling ball effect, where if someone, for example, someone is chronically sympathetic on the sphenoid bone in the skull shifts out of place, which kind of has this downstream effect on the whole rest of the body misaligning, and there is a sort of global contraction of the flexor muscles. And is this something that you're familiar with? That
not in that terminology, but it would seem, like the shift in like the accessory muscles of breathing are all crossing the neck into the thorax. So you probably got a forward head posture effect, poor position of the diaphragm. So once again, often we look at the symptomatic or pathological side. We should be looking at that in relation to ideal. The means for coming out of these pathological presentations are similar, but because we tend to focus on the symptomatic side, it seems like there's many, many, many symptoms, like an infinite number of symptoms. There's not, there's just, you have this presentation because you're out this way, The ways you're getting it wrong are known because we can come back to, the posture, the stability and the development, that first 15 months of life. And when we help you reintegrate that information, then, you're integrated once again. You've got a problem because there's a lack of integration in the way the system is seeing itself.
Let's talk about proprioception here for a little bit. And this seems to be a highly sophisticated movement for the brain, neuromuscular integration. How does this play into your work?
Yeah, well, proprioception is a key understanding in terms of what you're influencing. So the muscle spindle, which is the main proprioceptor, sits as a teardrop-shaped receptor in the contractile apparatus. When that shape changes its shape due to the muscle contracting, that's what registers at the brain level. So the muscle spindle, if it's changing its shape slowly, that would be like a yoga type of contraction, so lengthening under tension. And the nervous system will allow you to do that as long as you do not exceed. If the shape changes too fast, then the muscle will contract instead of lengthen because you went too far too fast. You went against the proprioceptive information that was present. Now, if I'm on a tennis court and I need to change direction to get to a wide ball, then that's happening super fast. It's happening ballistically, and it creates a spring-like effect. So that represents the continuum of the proprioceptive possibilities. So in other words, we need to do the slow, controlled movement to get an increase in the length-tension relationship of muscles. And we need to do whatever other work we need to do in the ways that it's got to express dynamically. So it's a continuum. Plyometrics would be the extreme end of ballistic proprioception, creating the shock-absorbing and spring-like effect. And slow, controlled lengthening would be at the other end. And, it's like a software program. We need to be exercising all the multidimensional aspects of the program. Now, interestingly, the Golgi tendon organ doesn't get spoken about that much, but it sits in the myotendinous junction, and it's detecting tension. So if it senses that the muscle can't produce the work that's needed, then it inhibits the muscle. So it says, no, you can't handle this load. We might pull this tendon off this bone, so I'm going to shut down how much power I'm going to give you. Now, when people are overtrained, I think this inhibition, or my experience is that this inhibition is running the show. So they go to do X amount of work capacity and they just can't get it out of themselves. Because, they need to stop for a while and reboot and recharge and get rid of this inhibition type effect. And then the third receptor is like the joint receptor, mechanoreceptors in the joint, which is, detecting joint motion. So those three receptors make up, overall proprioception.
Do you think that this inhibition that you're talking about would play into a sort of trauma scenario where there may be a joint or a pattern of movement that created some kind of trauma, or there was a traumatic event that happened during that where, for example, I'll find some clients that it's like the whole movement itself goes offline. They're unable to feel into the range of motion anymore. There's some kind of a neurological disconnect that's happening.
Oh, definitely. And I think that's where you've got to be able to do work around, if it's a joint system, you need to be able to do supportive work so that it begins to wake up without necessarily going, like it's just not capable there. So we've got to usually go down to a lesser position and restore more, central control, and then just begin to be able to go to the edges of the competency, that the person can, yes, I can do that. Now hold it, hold, good. And it's part of, the body brain acknowledging that this can start to be used again, because again, it's the way the system protects itself is it's looking for harm. And so if we take away the threat of harm, then we can start to do well again. But that's down to the skillfulness of the practitioner. I mean, back to Alexander, he was an interesting pioneer. One of his famous quotes was, "Find out how you're causing harm and stop it." It's beautiful. And again, this is, comes back to this self-observation thing again, that people, like if they've got a chronic thing going on, part of it is just, now what am I doing consistently, habitually, that's causing this harm effect to plague me? And again, if they look at it and begin to understand it, they can give you better information.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that takes a lot of mindfulness.
Yeah.
Not something a lot of people want to do, unfortunately, when it comes to life, right? I mean, just everything. Well, amazing. Yeah. Well, Mark, how do folks get more information? I see you do online consultations. You got a bunch of social media going on. How do folks get more info?
Yeah, well, so I've got Mark on Movement, Instagram and Facebook. So that's probably where I post, and Twitter. That's where I post the most. I occasionally blog on the website. It's just difficult to find time to write a decent blog, if you know what I mean. But I'll be blogging semi-regularly. I've just started a company with osteopath colleague Jordan Mcgrath, and we are looking to do much more in the online space and also in the education space. So seminars. We're actually getting up a seminar for therapists around a lot of what we've discussed today, as well as we believe people should be combining like the DNS with learning how to move, in nature, like on an oval, on a grass area, just ways of moving, combine that, and then like a martial arts, taking some of the best aspects of the martial arts, and particularly the way it relates to DNS, and those three pillars of DNS, ways of moving, and aspects of the martial arts. That's going to be a one-day seminar. Now that's obviously in Australia, but we'd certainly be looking, I think, over the next 1 to 2 years to take some of this stuff on the road to, more internationally. So just to let you know, we're in development phase with it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, you got a ton of info on your website, and you do post a lot in social media, so listeners can definitely get a lot from you there. Thank you so much for your time, Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jonathan. I really like the way you do your interviews. It's like a great discussion.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks, mate.
Have a good one.